and thank you for watching this short video about the Housing Choice Voucher program. Today's video is going to be specific to landlord briefings. We're going to talk about information that prospective landlords need to know about this program in order to participate in your local communities. What we're going to start out with is talking about some of the roles and responsibilities of the players that sort of make up this program in the Housing Choice Voucher side, or almost more commonly referred to as Section 8. So we're going to start by talking about the agency, the public housing authority that owns and operates these particular vouchers. Then we're going to talk about a little bit about the Housing Choice Voucher applicants and participants that make up the program. And then, of course, the most important part of the puzzle is you, the landlord, and how all of these relationships fit together. So by taking a look at the visual that we see here on the screen, we'll start at the top of the triangle with the agency, or the public housing authority. This is the entity that gets the federal funding and does the determination of eligibility for low-income families that are in your local communities. If a family is determined to be eligible, then they will receive what's called a voucher, which you see indicated on the left-hand side of the visual here. And that voucher is merely an agreement between the agency and the Housing Choice Voucher participant that they will receive rental assistance in the community if they comply with the rules and regulations. Once that process has been determined, then that individual is going to be sent into the community to interact with individuals like yourself, prospective landlords. And that document that will ultimately be executed between you and the Housing Choice Voucher participant is the lease. The lease itself is a fairly standardized document that most of your apartment or realtor associations will have a standardized model for. And this particular lease is executed between you and the Housing Choice Voucher participant. And then the third piece of the puzzle, as we see represented on the right-hand side here, we have yourself, the landlord, and the housing authority executing what's called a Housing Assistance Payments Contract, or a HAP contract. And this HAP contract is the main body that really brings this program together. And it's an executed agreement between the agency and the landlord that indicates we are going to financially provide you some rental assistance on behalf of this family at your particular property. We're going to talk about this HAP contract a little bit later in the presentation because it is a major document that really brings all of this together. Now, there are some other documents that really make up this bigger relationship, and some of the documents that are very specific to you, the landlord, as far as what you're filling out and the information that's being evaluated on your properties are what we see identified on the screen here. We're going to address these very quickly and then talk about each document in a little more detail. So the first document you see is called a Request for Tenancy Approval. This is one of the first documents that the Housing Choice Voucher participant gets once they have been deemed eligible. This is also the first document that you are going to be represented with whenever a particular participant is wanting to rent from you and your property. So the Request for Tenancy Approval is the first document that we are going to see and fill out as landlords, and we'll talk about how to do that correctly in just a moment. The next one are the state and landlord tenant laws as well as tenant screening. This is really more of an information perspective that you need to be aware of as a landlord, and what are some of the best practices and resources that you can use to screen prospective participants that are going to be living in your property. Next are the housing quality standards. These inspections are federally regulated criteria that allow the agency to get a little bit of a physical representation of your property to ensure that it is meeting the safe, affordable, and decent housing needs that are being provided in the community to low-income families. Next are reasonable rent determinations. These are the determinations that are made along with the physical evaluation of your property to ensure that the most reasonable rent is being charged to these families and that the government is executing the most responsible disbursement of subsidy payments on behalf of low-income families. And then last but certainly not least is that Housing Assistance Payment Contract. And again, we'll talk about that in detail and what are some of the key items that you need to be aware of within that contract. So the first, this is the most exciting document I think a lot of families show up to your doorstep with, and this is this Request for Tenancy Approval. And this form really does serve two purposes. Number one, it's really to identify you, the property owner, and the property location that is going to be put into question for leasing. The second thing, and by far the most, I'd think, important or critical piece of information, is the utilities that are being provided to the unit and are going to be the financial responsibility of the prospective participant. Let's take a look at the top half of this RFTA form we've been discussing. Now, just as a note that sometimes you will have participants that are wanting to execute a lease at this point in time, or you yourself may be under the impression that this is the point in time to execute a lease. Please keep in mind that these documents do need to be executed and processed by the agency before any leasing activities can take place. So just a little bit of knowledge there in case you are presented with this opportunity to sign a lease before some of these other documents are put into place. Now, as we take a look at the top half of the document, I want to just highlight a couple of points here. In sections 1, we've got the name of the public housing agency, the local housing authority, which you can get from the participant if you don't know it already. Number 2 is the address of or unit, street address of the unit that is in question that we're going to be potentially leasing. And then as we look at the fields that go in below here for 3 through 8, I want to take specific mention of number 7, which is the security deposit. And do keep in mind that while there is lots of affordable housing assistance for ongoing rent, there are not current any programs offered by agencies to help with this security deposit. So you may be presented with some negotiation or some options to sort of factor in security deposits, or there may be some other community resources to maybe help attain some security deposits. And the other keynote about security deposits is that, as we're going to be discussing here in a little bit, with that landlord and tenant law that is in your state, there are going to be some specific sort of measures that you can take with the security deposit collection and returning of security deposits as well. So for any specific knowledge, please refer to your state law for security deposits. The rest of the information here can actually be filled out by the housing authority unless you are unaware of any subsidies that your property may be receiving, which would be fairly rare. You know, if you're under a program there, you would be aware of it, but most of this information on the top half should probably be left blank. Okay. The top portion are some data fields that allow you to enter your name and the property address, how many bedrooms are in the unit, and that's fairly customary. The part that we see the most confusion over is at the bottom part of this form, which indicates what utilities are actually being provided to the unit and which utilities are being paid by the tenant. So our first indication here is O for owner and T for tenant. So when you first get this particular form and you look at some of these, items of utilities and some of the service provisions that are being offered, and then we get to this right-hand column where we see provided by and paid by. Now, what they want to see in the provided by columns are not that you are providing or paying for that utility, but merely that the property has this utility with this particular service, whether that be natural gas or electric or some other type of utility provision. These are traditionally provided by the owner in that unit itself. So if the unit provides this utility to be delivered, then you would consider it provided by the owner. The two items you may want to keep an eye out for are at the very bottom here on the refrigerator and the Ranger microwave. If these utilities are not offered in the unit whenever the participant moves in, then that is really the only time you would see the tenant provided, or a T, down in the left-hand column over here as provided by. Okay? For any of those utilities that are going to be the financial responsibility that are separate from rent being charged, those are being paid by the tenant, which you see represented in the right-hand column. So looking at this form, this is a little bit more of a traditional RFTA, which we should probably see more times than not. So O's in the provided by columns and T's for those utilities that the tenant is paying for, indicated in the right-hand column. Okay, our next one are the landlord-tenant laws and tenant screening. Because we have so many other factors to determine eligibility within this Housing Choice Voucher program, a lot of our folks are really only screening for some very specific items to determine whether or not the family is eligible to receive this assistance. As far as being a good participant or a good tenant in your unit, that's a screening element that is not really covered by your local housing authority. So we need to review our state laws so that we understand the rights and responsibilities of not only the property owners and landlords, but the rights and responsibilities of tenants so that we know what screening elements are most appropriate. Now, a simple Google search for your state law will be the easiest way to find that. Every state has a landlord-tenant law that you can reference for these key details. keeping in mind that most of your state laws are usually ratified about every 2 years. So if you have a particular state law that's come into question, you may want to look at the frequency of the last update to that law and make sure you have the most up-to-date citation. Now, as I stated, most housing choice voucher programs are doing minimal screening for eligibility. However, within this screening element, there is some caveats for criminal history, and there's also some other caveats for any debts owed to other housing authorities. So there will be some minimal screening sort of suitability criteria that you could use to base your tenancy approval on. And just inquiring with the housing authority about any information they may have to share with you would be the easiest way to attain that. But looking at some alternative sources for screening and suitability is ultimately the responsibility of you, the landlord, to ensure you are allowing the most qualified participants to live in your property. Housing Quality Standards, or HQS, as you most commonly hear it referred to as, and these are regulatory guidelines that have been set forth to ensure that the most safe, decent housing is actually being provided in our local communities. These particular guidelines may have some additional building codes or local considerations that are based on weather, resources, or some other factors that may also be put into play as well. And again, a simple inquiry to your agency will clearly identify those. But the inspections themselves can be done at any time throughout the year, and let's review some of the inspections that you will most commonly see. The first one is the initial pre-HAP, that Housing Assistance Payment Contract Inspection, and this is to ensure before any business is done and any contracts are entered into that we do have a quality physical property that we can sort of inspect and look at for this family. Number two is the annual inspections. So each year we have to at least annually inspect this unit to ensure that it's maintaining a level of housing quality standard. This also does a great job for screening for you as well to ensure that your folks are not exceeding the normal wear and tear of the unit. And those are identified inspectable items as well. The next item that we see down here are quality control inspections. And again, these inspections are actually done by other members of the agency to ensure two things. Number one, that their staff and inspectors are catching and inspecting items in the proper manner. And also, too, to add a little bit more sort of quality of inspectable service that you would expect from the agency themselves. So they're not only checking to make sure that the inspectors are looking and evaluating the property correctly, but also that they know what items to look at and how to evaluate these deficiencies correctly to ensure you're getting the best results. And then last is the audit or compliant inspections, and these are usually generated by requests from the public or by somebody from the Housing and Urban Development, which is coming out of headquarters. Okay? Now, after we have some physical inspection, we have to make some reasonable determinations on the rent that you are requesting. And there's some characteristics that we have to look at here, so let's look at those in a little more detail. Looking at these characteristics, this is what the agency is required to evaluate on properties in your community that are not assisted or receiving any kind of subsidy assistance to them at all. And some of the items that you see most commonly sort of referenced here are the location, the unit size, the unit type, the quality, and the age of the unit. These are a little bit more subjective, so if you're wanting to sort of know what other properties that are being compared, again, a simple inquiry to the agency, and they will give you a list of comparables that were used to determine whether or not the rent you are requesting is actually deemed reasonable. This again too is a fairly regulated, regimented process, and it has a lot of supporting data to whether or not a rent is determined reasonable. So if you do have any questions or concerns about the rent you're requesting and the legitimacy of its reasonableness, there should be plenty of support documentation through your local agency to ensure that the rent is being evaluated correctly. And last but not least, we are back to this Housing Assistance Payments Contract, or the HAP contract, which ultimately results in HAP payments that are going to be coming to you on a monthly basis. A couple of things here to identify is that, again, as we've stated a few times, this is the most vital document of relationship here that we're talking about. And it does put the requirement not only on you, but the financial obligation on the agency to ensure that those funds that have been sort of calculated for your assistance are being delivered to you on a monthly basis in a timely manner. If there are any disputes, and this is one of the most critical things about this document, the fact that you have a document entered into between you and the housing authority, and you also have a document entered into between you and the participant, that's your lease. If there are any contradictions, or if there are any issues between these two documents, the HAP contract will supersede. And that term is actually written within the HAP contract itself. So make sure that before you enter this contract to read through it very carefully so that you understand your roles and rights as a property owner and landlord, and then that way you have a much better idea on how to move forward successfully within the Housing Choice Voucher program. A couple of other little items on here is that we do see a lot of common turnover with property, especially investment property, which brings in a lot of landlords participating to this program. If you are under a HAP contract and you do happen to sell your property, please note that the transfer of the HAP contract must be approved by the housing authority before the sale of that property. So just a little thing to keep in mind there, especially if you are an investment property owner and you're wanting to get some participation in your local housing authorities. If you do intend to sell the property, just please note that the HAP contract must be approved by the housing authority before the transfer of that contract can take place. And with that being said, I think our last thing is, okay, great, how can I jump in and participate? Well, it's very easy. There are housing authorities that are set up to administer this assistance all over the country. You can find the ones in your backyard by very simply going to Google or your favorite search engine and typing in HUD PHA contact information. The first search find that you hit should be from HUD.gov, and that will provide a listing of all of the housing authorities in the entire country. By merely giving a phone call to your local agency, should be invited to one of their local landlord briefings or open houses, and you can learn a little bit more about doing business with the agency in your community. Again, I want to take just a moment to say thank you for watching this short video. It's been my pleasure. My name is Jeremy Spence. I'm a director with the Nelrod Company, and I look forward to seeing you in a training in the near future.